We are 100% spiritual. We are 100% consciousness, and consciousness is 100% metaphysical. However, we have identity, we have personality, and the absolute truth is we are one with the absolute truth. We are God, and simultaneously, the Supreme Person is the Supreme Person, and we as individual units of consciousness have a relationship of dependency and love, an exchange of love with that Supreme Person. I don't see anywhere else on the market of religion something, showing that product. And I think that product, if presented well, can really be called a science of spirituality.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Beyond podcast, going beyond the body, beyond the mind, beyond limiting beliefs. Today, we have my friend Cyril here from America, French-American, born in Los Angeles, studied in Oxford University, an expert, I would say, in meditation, already spent 50,000 hours of meditation, while I did my maybe 10, 15,000. Yeah, it's another level of understanding and going deep. When I ask you, what is your topic, what is your hobby, you said consciousness. I want to speak about consciousness. And yeah, Cyril, I would really like to hear and share with the audience your experience and your understanding about spiritual life, spiritual practice, and going deep, going beyond.
Thanks for having me on your show. It's an honor. And when you asked me what to speak about, I was like, why don't we speak about the topic of spiritual science and the idea of personalism as opposed to default non-dualism that modern scientists, those who are a little bit experimental, or those who want to go beyond the status quo or the accepted norm, the physicalist paradigm, we can explain what that means for those who don't know a little bit later, tend to always default to. And so I was wondering, we could maybe talk about consciousness and post-mortem survival, and what does spirituality mean as opposed to religion, and why is it perhaps that non-dualism, and again, when we might define those terms, why is non-dualism so popular among those both spiritualists and scientists, and a combination of both, as opposed to personalism? You still into talking about that?
Yeah, sure. I like the topic because my name is Advaita, and people always ask me what is the meaning about Advaita and non-dualism.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, I think it's a good starting point. Maybe you can explain what means non-dualism, dualism, and
so non-dualism. My limited understanding, although it's not really a complicated topic, is the philosophical or the theological position that people take, their belief, their worldview, to the effect that, first of all, there's a physical and a metaphysical dimension to reality. Reality has this sort of a dual dimension to it. One, the physical world that we perceive with our senses, and then a metaphysical reality that lies beyond, to use beyond the mind, beyond the senses. And so what is the nature of that beyond reality? Spiritual, metaphysical, as opposed to material. But then this idea of non-duality as it relates to personality, to individuals. In other words, the non-dualists will conclude that whatever variety we may see in this phenomenal world, in this physical world, is ultimately an illusion. And the sense of individuality is an illusion as well. And we have this ego, the non-dualists love to talk about destroying the ego, getting rid of the ego, because the ego makes you think you have personality. The ego makes you think you are an individual. And there is no such thing in the ultimate sense as personality, as individuality. Why? Because everything is one. Everything is, there are non-dual, streams in Christianity, such as with, Meister Eckhart. And I'm not a big scholar in that field, but you see it in the Islamic world with the Sufis. And you certainly see it to to the nth degree in the Sanatan Dharma tradition in the religions of India, which is a very, 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 very strong and super sophisticated and tradition, centuries old, if not millennial old, of non-dualism. And so, there's this famous, or relatively famous for those who know a little bit about Indian religions, but this famous saying, Atman becomes Brahman, right? That ultimately there's just spirit, and the individual person, the individual souls ultimately become one, and we are all one. And in that sense, there's no there's no you and me. That's duality, because ultimately we're all one. Did I describe it pretty well?
Yeah, this was, I mean, my understanding many years. All my friends, we all thought like, yeah, when we started spirituality, that we all kind of one energy and we all come from the same source. And when we come with nothing and when we leave this body, we go back to the same source and emerge kind of with each other. And yeah, and we had also this understanding that actually that we part of God, that we are God, but separated in many. And yeah.
And the many becomes one again by the process of meditation, by the process
Yeah.
of, and
It
hence
is
the
very
notion.
common. This is everyone has this understanding nowadays that, I mean, on spiritual paths, you see it very often that people think or understand. And to some part, it might be even true that we are one, but the understanding is a little bit, yeah.
One-sided. And perhaps I'd love to hear from you, this notion that you've talked to me often about, this idea of inconceivable oneness and difference, this
mm,
simultaneous oneness and difference. I think you just touched on that.
yeah. I mean, this is a topic I was introduced much later on a spiritual path.
So you
Where,
started as as a non-dualist, huh?
yeah, I was rooted in Christianity. And then I had some things happening in my life where I realized, no, there can't be a God. The world is so cruel and bad and dark. And then I met a Muslim friend and he told me, yeah, look, if there's no God, okay, maybe there's an evolution and everything, but where does the universe come from? Where was the Big Bang coming from? And I was like thinking, yeah, actually, there must be some origin. So I came to the conclusion there must be a God. Yeah. Then I met a Buddhist, and this Buddhist, he introduced me to the practice of meditation and enlightenment and nirvana, and then it became more about this topic that I'm not the body, I'm suffering, and I wanna leave this world behind because it's actually a place of suffering, and I'm a spiritual being made out of love and light and energy, and we anyways all one. And then I met a monk on the street who gave me a book called the Bhagavad Gita. And the Bhagavad Gita all of a sudden speaks about various aspects of the divine, of the soul of God. Yeah, that God is a person. And I never heard about this concept before. I mean, in Christianity, you have Jesus and Trinity,
The
but you have
Father.
Father, yeah. But you have God as a person, and simultaneously also the Brahman, the impersonal aspect of God, and the aspect in the heart, God in the heart. It was a different level of understanding, and to come to the point later when you study this Vedic books and the yogic ancient texts where it is described that we are one in one sense, yeah, qualitatively, yeah, we are part of God, part of the divine, but we're also all different and individuals, yeah. And I realized I wanted to destroy my personality because I suffered so much, yeah, to merge with something higher. And but later I got the understanding that actually everything we experience here on the material platform comes from something spiritual, yeah. Like one teacher says, life comes from life, yeah. Life doesn't come from nothing, not from matter. And then more and more I realized actually my own personal, yeah, spiritual development. And I see you as a person, I have my wife, my children, yeah. And we can't say we are all one, you know. When you suffer, do I suffer? Or when you're rich and I tell you, give me all your money because it's mine, we all one. And you can see so much beauty in individuality and personality. And yeah, and I think that concept of spiritual life nowadays is to neglect the material world and neglect my own personality and just merge with something higher, what is probably beautiful also. but it leads us maybe to a misconception of reality. Yeah?
I would agree. Do you know about? I know you know about them, but are you interested in the work, for example, of the late, he passed away, but the Dr. Ian Stevenson and
I'm so
company?
familiar, a little bit, but
He was the head of the psychiatry department at the #1 public university in all of America, or #2 after University of California, University of Virginia.
mhm.
So a public school, a public university, and he was the head of the psychiatry department, and the university allowed him to, for decades and decades, just like a mad scientist in his laboratory, and he was funded by by U.S. government money to focus. His whole career was based around or centered around studying thousands. He had thousands, and his legacy still continues. The university has there's a whole department now called the Division of Perceptual Studies, and his successor is a guy called Jim Tucker, who continues with his team to examine only one phenomena, and that is children who claim to remember their past lives.
Oh yeah. Wow.
And he's the first one. It's not that the phenomena didn't exist before he studied it in a very rigorous scientific way, but he was the pioneer in the modern world to study the phenomena with the type of scientific rigor that is required in advanced biology or advanced neuroscience, or to be able to publish papers in peer-reviewed journals. As a matter of fact, his only complaint before he died, he said, after all these decades of and he wrote like 20 or 30 books, some of them very boring, precisely because he went through so much tedious details of what the child so-called remembered, and is it possible that there could have been some factor that led to concluding that this case is, or case X is very interesting, but it cannot be put in the category of most probably reincarnation as the best explanation, because so he complained that his colleagues did not take him seriously enough. He was lamenting that his colleagues did not take his work scientifically seriously enough. As a matter of fact, as a small parenthesis, the most famous guy today in 2025 who deals with consciousness, probably one of the most, is a guy called David Chalmers, who teaches philosophy at the University of New York in New York City. And he wrote several books on consciousness. He came up with this notion of qualia. It's called the hard problem of consciousness. In other words, he raised the issue of like the very idea of perception, the fact that we see something as blue when it's really not blue. It's and the idea of how you feel, like all these, how do you explain that in terms of consciousness? And it's sort of unsolvable up till today. So even though that's all he thinks and writes about, I wrote to him some months ago because I was thinking of perhaps doing a PhD in philosophy in the field of consciousness. And I referred to him. I mentioned the work of another philosopher at the University of, in the South, Georgia State University, Professor Almader, who wrote a book about 15, 20 years ago about how, on a philosophical basis, reincarnation makes sense. And so this David Chalmers, though, he just replied, politely, but in a one sentence, saying, in this department we don't take this phenomena very seriously. And so anyway, this is a small detail, but coming back to personalism and impersonalism, the reason I brought this up to you, Advaita, is because it seems that those scientists who do deal with the possibility that consciousness survives physical death, and hence, for example, studies on children who remember their past lives, but there's also other stuff like out-of-body experiences, near-body experiences. They practically all of them, always have a default conclusion when it comes to providing some sort of spiritual framework to this rogue phenomena that the physicalist modern scientist worldview cannot explain, right? Because according to the modern basic materialist or physicalist worldview, when you die, when the brain dies, consciousness dies. I mean, it ends. Flat line means there's nothing beyond. Because why? Because consciousness is a product of neurons and protons in the brain.
Just the brain. You're the brain, basically.
The brain becomes dead, consciousness stops. And so you've got these rogue phenomena, who defy this premise by showing pretty convincing evidence that a lot of these physicalists love to just marginalize and trivialize. Why? Because the cognitive dissonance, probably psychologically, would be too much to accept. Like, oh my God, if this is true, if there's children who actually really do remember a past life, if reincarnation really is a fact, holy cow, that means that our whole concept of what consciousness is goes out the window, is flushed down the toilet. And therefore our own lifestyle too becomes, put into question, because maybe that means that there's reactions, there's karma. And so therefore maybe I'm responsible for actions, and maybe I have a lifestyle that would, it's like a whole rabbit hole that I think maybe many of them don't want to go into. But those who do, those who are at least, I don't want to say honest enough, because that would be insulting the physicalists, but those who are, like, let's say, courageous enough to consider, some sort of spiritual paradigm that would explain this rogue phenomena, they always practically default to non-dualism. The unitary mind, the cosmic mind, different names for the same idea of Brahman. Like, ultimately, there's just one underlying substratum of consciousness,
the universe,
and we are all that. And the goal is just to merge into that. And I mean, I have an explanation it's a theological explanation. It's not, it's not an empirical explanation. So it's not like it's proof, but it's an explanation that's based on my own beliefs as a personalist, as someone who, like you, also believes in, okay, we are all one, but the idea of a supreme person, the absolute truth as a person, ultimately. So based on that paradigm, I have an explanation.
It's interesting because you have these two extremes, the modern science, believing that we are just the brain or the body, and after the body is dead, the brain is dead, there's nothing. And then you have the spiritualists who think we emerge and we all one and we become God, or we are God. And
or you have the theist. Oh, is that what you're going to go to? I'm sorry.
Yeah. And then you have the theists or personalists, or it's interesting, all this.
But among those, like those who are really the most famous in the world today, especially in the West, are Christians. Mm-hmm. Some Muslims, much less Jews, and in 99% of the cases, Christians, in my opinion, with all the wonderful expressions of love and devotion to God that are products that are produced over the last 2,000 years in the various Christian traditions, with all due respect, their notion of self is not nearly as clear cut as that found, for example, in the traditions of India, where it's very clear, whether you're a personalist or a non-dualist, that we have nothing to do with matter. That as consciousness, we have nothing to do with matter. Like, we are not matter at all. And therefore, belief in reincarnation. I remember when I did my thesis and my master's thesis at Oxford University about 10, 15 years ago on one of the early church fathers called Origen. If you type, do Christians believe in reincarnation on Google, you'll always get links to mostly non-academic and in many cases kind of very simplified links or content about Origen. Yeah, the early Christians did believe in reincarnation. Here's proof. Here's Origen. They point to Origen. This guy Origen was a Greek, and the reason he's not that famous is because he castrated himself when he was a young monk. I guess he was dealing with lust, and he thought, okay, I'm gonna. He did that, and as a result, because of the Catholic rule that someone who castrates himself can never be a saint, can never be canonized.
Okay,
wow. He was kind of like marginalized and fell through the cracks, and and is not nearly as famous and influential as he would have been if he hadn't done that stupid, passionate act as a young man. And also, a lot of his work were burned at in the library. The famous library of Alexandria. There was a big fire, so a lot of his work is no longer existing. But anyway, I remember when I was doing my thesis on him, I didn't do such a serious job the first time around. As a matter of fact, they almost failed me, and they gave me a second chance. Like, you have 3 months to redo this paper, otherwise we don't give you your degree. So the first time around, I kind of I was too much influenced by these sort of very simplistic notions. And I remember when I was in front of these this panel of experts in early Christian thought, I was like, yeah, Origen believed in reincarnation. And the guy gave me the sauce. He was like, no, you don't understand. Or you could maybe make the choice that Origen believed in the pre-existence of the soul, but not in reincarnating in subsequent bodies. And so that was the first time I had heard that. So the idea among some Christian is that maybe the soul existed before the body. But this in no means, according to strict Christians, implies or means that the soul continues to live after the death of that body, because you only have one life, you see. So maybe the soul existed before, but you really only have one life. I mean, it's stated in the Bible, only man, what is it? There's some famous verse in the Bible that you hear that, man is only given one life, and then you're judged, for forever, and so on. So why do I mention this? Because on the one side, okay, you have these material, like you say, the physicalists, the hardcore materialists. Like you said, consciousness is just a product of the brain. When you die, it's game over. Next, you have the non-dualist. No, consciousness is 100% spiritual, is 100% metaphysical. It has nothing to do with matter. But we're all one in the end. And then in the world of theism, most of the microphone is controlled by people who don't believe in reincarnation and who have this weird concept, or I would say weird, or at least unclear concept of who the self is. Can I tell you one other story, personal anecdote?
I just wanted to add something to the Christianity and reincarnation. I met Christians 20 years ago on the street. They gave me a book, and in German we call them Urchristen, the original Christians or something they call themselves. And they are vegetarian. They believe in karma and reincarnation. And then ask them how come, and then they live according to the Gospel of Thomas. And they said the Vatican suppressed this gospel. It's not allowed in the Bible because it speaks about reincarnation. And
interesting.
Yeah, it was really because you mentioned
they're a minority though, huh?
Huh?
They're definitely a minority, unfortunately.
Yeah, but they were different somehow. They had a completely different understanding about the self, about the soul, about previous and next life, and I was quite amazed. Yeah.
When my father died in about 7 years ago, I went to see the Catholic priest at the Église Sainte-Geneviève, the Catholic church next to where my dad lived in the Latin Quarter of Paris. I had a private meeting with him a few days before the funeral. My father was not very religious, but by my older brother, who's like 20 years older than me from my father's first marriage, he's a devout Catholic. Even though he's a scientist, he's a devout Catholic. So he insisted that there should be a Catholic, funeral for our father, who was quite agnostic. So everyone went along with his suggestion. So I went to see the priest, and I said, "Listen, in our family, because at the time I did spend time in different ashrams, and in a way, I consider myself a pastor or even a priest." Of the personalist tradition of India. I was even ordained at one point in 97 as a priest. So I told him, listen, I'm the only I'm the only kind of official priest in the whole family. Let me speak some verses from the Bible about how the soul lives on forever, because there are some verses from the Bible that talk about the eternality of the soul. And the guy was very close-minded. He said, no. So I didn't want to argue. And so when he was giving the talk during the funeral in the church, the coffin of our father was right there, open coffin. It was January, it was cold, I remember. And he mentioned this. He said, we have learned from the Greeks that the soul is eternal. And I know he was talking to me directly. He said, but we as Christians, we also believe that we are, in large part, our body, that the body is an important constituent of our identity, of who we are, right? And as a matter of fact, as a small parenthesis, Advaita, we can make the claim that there's one passage in the Bible where Paul writes to the Thessalonians, the early Christians in that Greek island of Thessaloniki, and he tells them, I hope you are all well, waiting for the return of our Lord Jesus. They're still waiting 2,000 years later, but waiting for the return of our Lord, and I hope you're all well in body, mind, and spirit. And we could claim that that little passage has influenced Western civilization's sense of self-identity in a way that is way deeper than we actually realize. And therefore, this notion of body, mind, and spirit is so actually deeply rooted in Europe and America's DNA in terms of, who we are. Like we're 33% body, 33% mind, 33% soul or consciousness. But then if that's the fact, then who reincarnates? You know what I mean? Because if we are really our body, well, our body dies. So do we lose part of ourselves when the soul reincarnates? So therefore, coming back to your point, and just to conclude, what's the alternative? Well, the alternative, I would say, is Vaishnava personalism that comes from the Indic tradition, because it's just really the only one on the market out there that doesn't completely always go to the default, we are all one, we are all one, we are all one, but doesn't make the mistake of stating, oh no, but we are body to a great degree, or we are mind to a great degree. There's that beautiful middle path where, no, we are, the Advaita Vedantas, the non-dualists are right. We are 100% spiritual. We are 100% consciousness, and consciousness is 100% metaphysical. However, we have identity, we have personality, and the absolute truth is we are one with the absolute truth. We are God, and simultaneously, the Supreme Person is the Supreme Person, and we as individual units of consciousness have a relationship of dependency and love, an exchange of love with that Supreme Person. I don't see anywhere else on the market of religion something, showing that product. And I think that product, if presented well, can really be called a science of spirituality that is not always the default, non-dualism. What do you think?
Yeah, I love that. When I first came in contact with this understanding, philosophy, or science, spiritual science, what it was called in the Bhagavad Gita, I was like, yeah, actually, it made sense to me. And on a much deeper level, not so artificially, okay, you read something and it sounds great, but if you go really deep, it really clicks, yeah. There must be more. There can't be just one life, yeah. It somehow, I mean, now when I speak about it, I can't find reasoning because it's so ingrained in myself, yeah. But then the understanding that God is a person, that was something new, and I really could relate to it because I did yoga, I tried Tai Chi, I read Buddhist scriptures, and this time I was reading the Lotus Sutra and Patanjali Yoga Sutra, but I never heard this notion of God as a person and
the soul as a person too,
and the soul as a person, and my eternal relationship, yeah, to this person. And then it was mentioned the drop in the ocean. We can understand the drop has the same quality, but the quantity is different. And the aspect of Sat Chit Ananda, that the soul is eternal, no beginning, no end, exists, existence, Chit full of knowledge, conscious, and Ananda full of love and bliss.
And Vigraha.
Vigraha, and
Please
the form.
explain that term. That's or Swarup or Vigraha. Can we go into that? This idea of Swarup or Vigraha.
Yeah.
I guess you want me to do it. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, in Sanskrit, this notion of Swarup literally just means form, a form. And so in the personalist tradition of India, you have this idea that the soul, the individual unit of consciousness that we all are individually, certainly in this conditioned state, covered by a physical body with which we unfortunately identify and therefore think I am a man, I'm a woman, I'm German, I'm American, I'm French, I'm white, I'm black, I'm gay, I'm straight, and so on and so on. That unit of consciousness has an eternal, individual, spiritual form, which includes a personality, a spiritual desires, and a form, literally a form. And here I think it's really apropos to reference the testimonies that we find in the writings and the poetic, intimate writings of certain Vaishnava or personalists from the Sanatan tradition saints. Because this is, like you say in French, du jamais vu. Like we've never seen this type of stuff. So, if with your permission,
but you have it even in the Bible. We are made in the image of God. All these passages. It's there, but we don't really comprehend or understand, I think.
But here in these testimonies, it's like it's taken to the next level. Because, for example, definitely, you have. The writings of this 16th century poet saint called Narottam. His full name was Narottam Das Thakur.
Yeah.
And so here, for those who are scientifically minded, we're veering away from empirical. This is no longer, scientific evidence for post-mortem survival. However, human testimony can also not be completely, disregarded. So this is human testimony, no way to prove it, quote unquote, in terms of empirical science. But I think it bears saying that, hey, on this planet, there are, human beings who for centuries, if not millennia, have all realized and written about, in some cases, the following. And what is the following? So you have a male practitioner of this tradition who's, let's say, 50 or 60 years old, whatever. So he's got a male body with a male sexual organ. And because he's reached, theoretically, such deep and high levels of spiritual awareness, he has come in contact or reawakened knowledge of his form, of his Swarup, this idea in Sanskrit, again, of a spiritual form. And it just so happens that Swarup, that eternal form, has a female, form. It is female and young. And so you have these writings of Narottam Das Thakur, of, for example, Bhaktivinoda Thakur, also more in the early 19th century. Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati Thakur is more early 20th century. And these are just the ones that I know of. Who write...
Goswamis.
Yeah, exactly. Back to the 16th century. And they, even though they're in male forms, physical forms, they identify as, and it's funny because, this whole thing, well, now it's kind of calmed down with the Trump administration, but, up to before there was this whole, I identify as this. So these male saints are identifying as, are claiming that eternally, beyond their 70-year-old existence in that particular human male body, they are eternally a 14-year-old goddess who has a full-fledged human-like but 100% spiritual, like you mentioned, Satchit Ananda Vigraha form. and a body that never grows old, that never deteriorates, but has a particular specific form and even color of dress and color of hair and a particular eternal activity vis-a-vis that supreme person or God. So it's amazing. You've got these saints, these male saints who are just like, old men who are living very simply, with just enough to cover their bodies, and they're spending all day praying or connecting with the divine. And in their writings, they're like, I'm actually a 16-year-old, 14-year-old, whatever, 15-year-old young girl with a full-fledged spiritual body. And eternally, I'm collecting flowers to help another goddess make a garland of flowers to put on the neck of that supreme person. And all that supposedly in a metaphysical dimension, in a spiritual reality, in the kingdom of God, as Christians would say,
But then you can say, I mean, for outsiders, this is very sentimental and far-fetched.
Sure, sure.
But
And therefore, the question is, I'm
these
sorry, but
personalities were not just normal personalities. If you maybe can explain about them, they were very intelligent, smart, and knowledgeable, and they gave us wisdom like we nowadays science can learn from them.
yeah. And why, like, from a philosophical and back now to empirical science, why do we always have to default? When I say we, I'm talking about those scientists who do admit or accept that consciousness is metaphysical. Why do we always have to default to this, cosmic mind, unitary consciousness, we're all one concept? And there's, as I told you at the beginning, and I'd love to explain it, to unpack my belief why there's this strong, almost irrational skepticism towards this idea of personhood being a fundamental building block of reality. Because look, you have children who remember their past lives. Okay, so here's a kid, he dies, and there's another kid, whatever, a year later, born somewhere else, who claims all sorts of details that correspond to the kid who died in XYZ fashion, right? And after they see, okay, there's all these testimonies, details of the way the kid died, or some of these kids even have birthmarks. Like some of these kids who are born have a birthmark, like a round birthmark here and there, for example, behind the back, and they'll say, "Yeah, I was killed by a gunshot in a past life," and so we could, we could say that birthmark corresponds to the bullet,
or burned in fire, and you see the mark in the next
fire. So that, from a logical point of view, it would seem that there's actually a person, or at least let's say that it's not inconceivable or irrational to claim that there's actually a person who's going from one body to the other. And from a philosophical / theological point of view, when you talk about karma, unless you believe that there's actually a person who's responsible for creating and generating karma, the fruits of which are experienced in the next body, in other words, a person, a spiritual person in one body, A, who does XYZ, and then after the death of body A, when that same person is in body B, the fruits or the reactions of the actions that this person did in body A come back to haunt him or bless him in body B. All that seems to point to, at least, why not say that there's a person? And if there's not a person, the big question is, who gets the karma? How do you explain, so from a philosophical point of view, totally. To not, to think of, to be a non-dualist is really problematic to explain karma,
What's the use of living or love or grieving when another person, when you just, I mean, now we don't speak about the understanding of being the body. We still speak from we in a metaphysical reality that we understand we are the soul, or we some consciousness. But how can we, I mean, for me, it's personally, what I understood at one point, or I hope to realize, is, okay, I come from some divine energy or person, and I'm a person, and if this divinity or this impersonal feature or universe create me as a person, that means I'm something more, I'm something better and higher than God or the universe
or the source, like you mentioned.
The source, and
how you're more than the source.
But we think as person, as blood, like I cut my hand, I bleed, and in the spiritual world, how can I be a person? Because we identify still, even if we think we're spiritual and we understand that we're the consciousness, we still think we're the body. Because for us, person means to have a personality embodied, that we can't comprehend. That we are a spiritual form doesn't mean we have a body like now,
Hopefully not. Imagine having to use deodorant for eternity.
I like this example. You cut your hand, or you cut off your arm, okay? but I'm still the same person. Yeah, I just lost my arm. Yeah, it's not like I lost myself. Now I'm just 1/8 of a person because I lost my arm. Yeah.
As a matter of fact, there's all these studies on phantom limbs.
Mm.
Because there's personalists would say, personalists from the Vaishnava tradition would say there's an individual soul who has a Swarup,
Yeah.
but the mind that's been sort of like carrying that Atma or that soul for many reincarnations kind of has it's like a shirt that kind of takes on the shape of the body that it's covering.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a subtle arm, so when the gross arm gets cut off, you have some people who actually, there's scientific evidence for that, of phantom arms, right? Of people who still feel pain in their arm, or who feel like there's some sort of invisible arm there, even though physically it's just not there anymore. Right.
Amazing.
Yeah, totally amazing. Yeah, I love how you mentioned how non-dualism leads to despair, ultimately, to nihilism. Because and I love the example you use of your own child. You have two now or one?
Two, yeah.
I forgot. So of your own children, your own wife. If ultimately individuality is illusory, then the love that your children experience for you, the love that you experience for your children, the love that your wife experiences for you, the love that you experience for your wife, it's all illusion. It's all illusion. Whereas in the personalist perspective, the idea is not, your children are eternal souls. You're an eternal soul. Your wife's an eternal soul. Due to some divine arrangement, you're now together for at least this one lifetime. And while maybe at some moments that love for someone else may be tinged with a little bit of anger or impatience or childish selfishness or whatever, the point is, by the practice of meditation, prayer, and so on, and by the grace of the divine, one's individual consciousness becomes purified, but not annihilated. So as time goes on, your love for others becomes more and more and more refined and pure and selfless. But that's completely different from the idea that, well, to begin with, it's all illusory. If it's all illusory, why even get married? Why even have children? Why even do anything? Just commit suicide.
Yeah.
It's a very suicidal philosophy.
Yeah, but that's the point. Nihilism. I just want to, reject my personality. Just want to be free from suffering, free from this world. And this is the ultimate goal, I think, for many spiritualists, to leave this world behind, get liberated. And then what you're going to do then in eternity, you just be one, be nothing. What are you at the end?
And you touched on this point of fear of individual personality. You mentioned in your own life.
This was my own experience.
And I think it's the experience of many of us.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, if I'm, I don't want to be a person.
I like this example in yoga. First, you study yoga for your asanas. You practice like gymnastic, your body, you look good. And then you get some realization. You have some meditative experiences, and you come more on the platform from the body to the mind, that you understand, hey, wait a minute, I'm not this body. I just experienced something higher. And you more and more understand, actually, hey, I'm not meant to be here. Something is not right. I'm a spiritual person. I'm the consciousness within. But then you come to this understanding that, hey, actually, I want to be in the spiritual realm. I want to be God. I want to be free of suffering. Yeah. And then you get stuck there because you forget about that actually you're also a person. Yeah. And the person has desires and needs, wants to be loved. Ultimately, the goal, if I ask someone, I'm working with clients, they come to me because all kinds of problems and desires, but the main desire is they want to be happy.
Yeah.
There's nothing else. I want to be free, of stress, anxiety, fear. But why? I want to be happy. I want to experience joy. But how can you experience joy if you're not a person? How you want to experience joy if you're a bicycle or this microphone, or
How can you experience joy, actual joy, not just peace, but joy and variety of joys, plural, if there's no one to experience? It takes, like they say, it takes two to tango. It takes two to tango. You need, and therefore transcendental duality on the spiritual platform, not, mundane duality. Yes, it's true, we're not our body, and to think we're this body, that we're matter, that this in that sense duality is wrong. But transcendental duality, in other words, once you're already talking about things on the metaphysical platform, then when you're talking about individual souls with their individual eternal swarups or eternal forms and personalities, and how they among themselves exchange all sorts of wonderful emotions, and with a supreme person in the center of that, wow, what a wonderful, satisfying prospect. And why doesn't anybody go to that? Because I began, and so
Yeah, please.
to finish, can I give you my, it's not really mine, it's just, here I have to make reference to one famous statement in one of the sacred texts of the personalist tradition, namely the Bhagavata Purana. No, actually, one of the one of the Upanishads?
Ishopanishad. Oh.
Right. Well, it talks about how like, I know the Sanskrit. Can I quote some Sanskrit? Just one verse.
Sure.
So there's this verse that I learned a long time ago. It was taught to me by one of my mentors in Los Angeles. Atakshi Krishnanama adi na bhavet grayam indriyai sevon mukhe jivado svayam eva sfuratyada. And the meaning is simple. The supreme person, so the absolute truth in his personal self. I'm not going to say in his personal form, because that implies that the absolute truth is impersonal and sometimes manifests through some material form with which we meditate temporarily to ultimately become one with what's behind it. No, we're talking about a supreme person from whom everything, including the white light and the cosmic mind, emanates. So source as a personal source, as a person, that supreme person or that personal absolute truth is inaccessible through ordinary sense perception. And that's a premise that these Vedic literatures establish. Now, whether we agree with it or not, whatever, right? But within that system of thought, it's stated and it's understood, and it kind of makes sense too. Because if you want to have if you want to meet, Macron or Trump or whatever, Modi or the president or the king of Thailand, you can't just go and knock at his door. There's all sorts of filters and qualifications you require to access an audience with a great personality. So the same principle is there, that in order to access that sort of personalist, intimate, confidential aspect of ultimate reality, you can't access it with your senses, with the power of your mind, with the power of your senses, and therefore with the power of your microscopes, with the power of your telescopes. And I see you refer to Sri Ishopanishad, the idea of that type of knowledge or understanding of reality being revealed to one who has the right attitude, an attitude of humility and devotion and willingness to have the divine revealed through the process of service. That's an important element, service, and specifically through using our senses in the service of the absolute, starting even with specific senses like our tongue, and using the tongue to vibrate sounds of God's names, for example. And so there's this premise that's established that in order to access that reality, sense perception won't help. And therefore, because a lot of these scientists, like Kastrup, there's this famous Portuguese physicist and philosopher. I think he has 2 PhDs. He's all over the place on YouTube, and really revolutionary scientist. And he's totally against physicalist understandings of consciousness, but he's a hardcore non-dualist, And so guys like him or others, they kind of hit a wall, that they get to the point of, yes, we're all one. Ultimately, it's just the cosmic mind, the divine id, Brahman, to use a Sanskrit term, and there's nothing beyond that. And in a lot of the cases, because, well, it kind of justifies this famous verse that, hey, well, because they're trying to access reality through the power of their mind and their senses, they're going to hit a plateau. And the highest thing they can hit is this idea of non-dualism. There's nothing beyond non-dualism, and that's the ceiling. And to go beyond that, and we believe there is a beyond, the process is no longer sense perception and exercising one's intellectual capacities. It's a process of revelation through service. It's a question of attitude, of adjusting one's consciousness. So in a way, it's kind of depressing for you and I who are personalists, that, you know, you see all these scientists and you're like, oh my God, you guys are almost there. Like, yeah, okay, yeah, we're all Brahman, duh. But like, can't you like understand that there's a supreme person also, that we're all individual souls, you know? And it's kind of frustrating. But on the other side, it almost gives us faith that, you know what? The ancient literatures that we have faith in seem to be accurate, precisely because nobody's, or practically nobody's, accessing what we, you know, this understanding of personalism is testimony that this premise seems to be real. You follow what I'm explaining?
Totally. I just had some chain of thoughts and something to add. In January recently, I was in Switzerland with Keshav Swami, a personalist, a spiritual teacher, and we visited a talk from Deepak Chopra. Yeah, we met. We were mystically invited, and we met Deepak Chopra. And
who's a non-dualist,
personally, was a little bit. I was at the end of the talk. I was a little bit more confused, but the topic was consciousness, and he showed different slides, different photos. When you look at it, first you see a beautiful woman, but then you see a guy delivering a pizza and the same painting. And he showed that consciousness is subjective, that we all have a different experience. Yeah. But then his ultimate conclusion was that the table, the chair, and me, we all one. We're the same energy, we're the same consciousness. And I was with a really inspiring person, yeah, Keshav Swami, and next year he will be invited to speak there.
Cool.
I was just like thinking, I mean, like all the leaders of society come together to listen and to hear. And the conclusion was that we are all one, that we are consciousness, and there's nothing higher. Yeah. And you mentioned now some sacred texts and some verses. And when I got the spiritual name Advaita, because people ask me, what does it mean? Yeah. So it was not related to non-dualism. Actually, it was related to a personality 500 years ago, Advaita Acharya, who gave the message of the Bhagavad Gita in a way, Achintya Beda Beda Tattva, yeah, that everything is one, yeah,
one and different,
but one and different. And then later I researched Advaita in the Bhagavad Gita, and the appendix at the end, there's Advaita means that God's divine form, because you mentioned not form, God's divine self, yeah, and is body, mind, and soul. It's not different. It's all on the same level with God. Yeah, He has not a body or mind or a form or senses. Yeah, He is itself. Yeah. So this is also another meaning of Advaita. Yeah. And my question to you is, it's all subjective at the end. I mean, I had my personal spiritual experiences. You had your experiences. Deepak Chopra has his understanding, his experiences. So how can we, I mean, you can only experience it. You can't philosophically understand, maybe, that God ultimately is a person, that we as souls have a form. Yeah. What is your conclusion, or how would you help people to really go deeper and really understand that they say, hey, dude, what you say makes sense. I want to be a person. I want to understand deeper who am I. Yeah.
I think that philosophical argumentation does, especially for those who are influenced by ideas. You know, some people are not influenced by ideas at all, and some people are. So hopefully that there's still some on planet Earth who are influenced by ideas. I think philosophical arguments or theological arguments, and if at all based on scientific evidence, can be convincing. The final, I don't want to say punch or the knockout punch.
I mean, sorry to interrupt. Yes, it was also convincing for me when I heard the concept, and I never heard before that, hey, you're a person, God is a person, and you have a relationship with him and with everyone else. And I was like, wow, okay, this is what I want. I was looking for that. Yeah. So I was ready for the idea. Yeah.
And then the experience solidifies it. And what do we mean by experience? But well, before just talking briefly about the experience, like there was this rock band, Jimi Hendrix, in the 70s, the famous guitarist, Jimi Hendrix. Everyone knows him, even young people. His band was technically called the Jimi Hendrix Experience, because when you went to a Jimi Hendrix concert, you didn't just go to a Jimi Hendrix concert, you had the Jimi Hendrix Experience. But just a few days ago, I was in South India. I'm in India right now, in the north, and I was on this safari trip, this 3-week adventure with 150 people from 33 countries, going through very famous, very old, beautiful temples of the Vishnu tradition in South India. And at one point, we went to one of the top last beaches on the tip of South India, and it's sort of somewhat of a Western tourist place. And so all of us went to the beach to swim, and there was this German couple, both psychiatrists, who were traveling around Asia for 4 months, in their maybe late 20s, early 30s. And one of the ladies, no, it wasn't a polygamous arrangement. It was just one boyfriend, one girlfriend. She pulled out from her bag a copy of the book that you're talking about all the time, namely the Bhagavad Gita, an edition by a famous non-dualist teacher, Aurobindo, who has his ashram near Pondicherry in the south of India. And so both of them were very much in the non-dual school. Like they said, yeah, we love non-dualism and so on. And so when I explained what we just discussed now, I swear to God, and this is not, please don't take it like I'm trying to show off or anything. This is really just to show the beauty of the personalist alternative. So when I was explaining the idea of we're souls, we have a Swarup, God's a person, no, even after liberation of birth and death, she started, like tears started rolling down her eyes. And she says, wow, I've never heard it like this. Now I don't have to be afraid of my identity anymore.
Yeah, it was the same for me. I started to cry. I was like, wow, like I felt liberated, you know?
The experience is still the knockout punch, to use a fighting analogy, which I don't like so much, and that's where the practice of, well, in this tradition of kirtan, of chanting and praying and contact with sacred sound, for example, contact with divinity. We won't get into the details of it here because we're coming to the end. I don't want to take more of your time and the time of your audience, but like you mentioned, I agree with you that an experience of what's theoretically presented to us is important to solidify what makes sense on a experiential consciousness level, not just intellectual.
What hit me when I hear this phrase that I am the source of Brahman, I am the source of the impersonal understanding of this energy field where I connected with many years through meditation, yeah. But then all of a sudden God describes himself, yeah, that he is the ultimate source of everything. Everything comes from him. In Bhagavad Gita, he's Bhagavan, the one with the 6 qualities. And one of my teachers, he told me, we're all looking for being rich and famous and beautiful and knowledgeable and austere, maybe not so much, but yeah, strong. And then he compared it with cheap Elvis imitators, yeah. But we try to be also these 6 qualities, yeah, Bhagavan, because we ultimately are a person, and we are here, we want to imitate the supreme person. And I was so attracted to, because God ultimately, when you, without having a form, just to look into nature, in the impersonal aspect is already so attractive, yeah. But then when you meet God, yeah, and it says his name is not different, his form is not different, his abode, yeah, his associates, that everything. I just got a gift from a friend, a card, yeah, where it's written, those who see me in everything and everything in me are never lost to me, and I'm never lost to them, yeah. So, and I realized you can see God everywhere in everything, yeah. Not just in a form, yeah. He's everywhere. He's not just in the church. He's not just in a temple, yeah. I can see God in your words now when you speak. I can feel God in my children.
Likewise.
Yeah. But then, to conclude, maybe you can talk about who is God then, yeah? This personality we talk about and we relish and we would like to, be in association in a spiritual form at the end.
In
Maybe you can,
relationship with.
yeah. No, can you share, like, who is this person? Like,
I think, especially in the context of your podcast, at least establishing the possibility and the idea of the absolute truth being a person, a supreme person, as you beautifully described him, with these 6 qualities or these 6 opulences, unlimited beauty, unlimited strength, unlimited intelligence, unlimited detachment, unlimited fame. That itself is monumental. Now, with your question, there's no choice but to zoom in on the description of the identity of that supreme person as described in the very book that you quote, namely the Bhagavad Gita. And since you asked, well, according to the Bhagavad Gita, that supreme person is Lord Krishna, who claims as such. Lord Krishna or Lord Vishnu, depending on the North Indian tradition or the South Indian tradition. Who comes first? Who is the first avatar of who? Is it Krishna who's the first avatar of Vishnu, or is it Vishnu who's the first avatar of Krishna? But at any rate, both are completely in agreement that it's the supreme person. And Krishna and Vishnu are exactly the same identity, the same supreme person. So that's what, if you're going to quote the Bhagavad Gita, that's where Krishna himself claims, I am the supreme. Arjuna, who hears the Bhagavad Gita, tells Krishna, you are the supreme person. And Krishna, in many places, claims that he is the source. He is the source of everything. There you go for the answer.
This podcast is not just about, going beyond the body, beyond the mind, beyond misconception of reality, limiting beliefs. This is the intro, yeah. But ultimately, what I hope to help people to see, that's why I wanted to have you here also on this podcast, to understand that what is beyond, yeah. Who am I? Who is God? And we just touched now the surface of this topic, but
if I may add one last point on this very interesting thing you just said. Assuming that Krishna or Vishnu is that supreme person, okay?
Yeah.
Who is closer to him? The non-dualist, even the non-dualist from the Vedic tradition, who quotes Sanskrit texts, who refers to almost nearly the same, who may even refer to Bhagavad Gita in a non-dualist interpretation, but still concludes that there's nothing beyond Brahman, Or a sincere theist, let's say a sincere Christian, who, for one reason or other, may not understand or know that the Father, the Supreme Father, the Father that Jesus talks about, is Krishna or Vishnu, and yet expresses such sweet, deep, wonderfully devotional emotions towards that supreme person. Who is actually closer? And I'm willing to bet that the latter is. Wow, so I'm not, so understanding the exact identity of God, yeah, it's a great advantage. If Krishna happens to be God, yeah, great, bingo. You hear him directly in the Bhagavad Gita, but it's almost like, devotion, like you mentioned, we're essentially persons. And it seems like along with personhood, there's something that's undisconnectable, if that's a word, from personhood, and that is devotion, love. And you know how, like in urban, like in a city, for example, in a sidewalk where it's just all concrete, still sometimes you'll see a small little creeper, a small little plant that manages to, go through all that concrete and still find the light of the sun and grow in spite of being, in concrete. So I say this, and I say this with respect to our, fellow Christians, but it seems like even if someone may not be in the knowledge that Krishna is God or Vishnu is God, still, because devotion is such an intrinsic, natural component of the self, in spite of maybe a not so sophisticated theological apparatus in terms of scripture and knowledge, for the intellect to function, the heart will just pierce through, that concrete and still express such beautiful calling to that supreme person. And so to me, it shows one that, okay, knowledge of exactly who is that supreme person is perhaps it's great, but it's not like a all or nothing, do or die kind of, paradigm where, you don't accept Jesus, it's hell forever. And secondly, it's testimony to the very nature of ourselves, that we are all, like you said, we all want happiness, and we're all ultimately searching for happiness vis-a-vis a supreme person.
Wow, I can fully relate. I mean, even in my own tradition, I see so much misconception, misunderstandings, and philosophical differences. And then I meet all around the globe and in my work so many people from different traditions and religious practices. And I see so much personalism and beauty and devotion, where I feel like, wow, if I would have that devotion in my practice.
Totally.
So yeah, and ultimately that's the key. Yeah, this it doesn't matter where we come from, which religion or which system, which culture, which color. Yeah, we all persons. Yeah, we have a personal relationship with God, and this is the way where we can be close to God, when we understand that there's more than just my brain, my body, my oneness with everything and with God. Yeah, the universe. Yeah. I mean, there's many topics. You just opened the box of Pandora, and I really, relished our talk. I could just
Me
listen and
too.
absorb
Thank you.
and get inspired to talk. I will go out now and record a video, like a vlog, and just talk about what we just reflect about what we just discussed. And
That'd be
maybe there's
great.
some last words, some message you would like to give, or
You're in good hands, guys. Who's listening to here, you're in good hands with Advaita as your humble guide, and just I would say, stick to hearing his podcast, because he's a very non-sectarian, broad-minded, spiritualist. So yeah, you're in good hands.
Thank you. And how can we listen to you? Where can I find your?
I have a channel called American Krishna.
Yeah.
American Krishna on YouTube. So feel free to go there.
I will share the link in the comments below, and yeah, I definitely will invite you again if you find some time.
I'd love to.
Yeah, would be awesome. Then thank you so much, my brother.
Thank you very much, and thank you for it's really cool. I'm kind of like proud of you, not in a condescending way in any way, but as a colleague, I'm really proud that you're creating this content for people out there. It's great.
Thank you so much. See you again.
Thank you for inviting me.
Going beyond.
Going beyond.
Bye.